Hi, my name is Evan. I go to the University of Minnesota Duluth. Today I am at Digikey HQ's Makerspace, and this is Summer Break Edition. In this series, I'll first show you how to make a simple breadboard MIDI controller. Then I will expand on that by using a button matrix that will allow you to use more buttons with your MIDI controller. Lastly, I'll show you how to use a Raspberry Pi to make a portable MIDI synthesizer. Let's get started by going over the full bill of materials for the simple breadboard MIDI controller. 12 SPST switches, 2 10K potentiometers, a jumper wire kit, keycaps for the switches, an Arduino Leonardo, a clear plastic case for the Arduino Leonardo, jumper wire, a micro USB cable, and a solderless breadboard. There's a couple of tools that you'll need for this project, a wire cutter and some tweezers. Next, I'm going to start by putting the buttons into the breadboard. So I'm using 12 buttons, and I'm going to line it up so that the lead of the rightmost button lines up with a power rail. Because when I use jumpers, I'll want to make sure everything lines up. So I'm going to place the buttons so that each of them are 3 squares away on the breadboard. And what I'm also doing with these buttons is I'm using a piano keyboard layout where you'll see white keys and black keys. And I'm also going to leave enough space between the white key switches so that the black key switches will have enough room for their jumpers. Next, I'm going to take my potentiometers and clip off the legs. Now, if you were mounting these in a PCB, there might be holes left in the PCB that you can solder the legs to, but because I'm using these in a breadboard, it won't fit if these legs are in there. So I'm just clipping them off, and that way they'll lay flat on the breadboard. And I'm going to set those off to the side so that I can add my jumpers first. I'm going to first connect the ground rails together on my breadboard with a jumper wire. So I'm going to take my jumper wire and I'm just going to peel one of them off. Next, I'm going to connect the blue power rail with the negative sign at the top of the breadboard to the same one at the bottom of the breadboard. Now what I have to do with these switches is I have to ground one lead, which means that I'm going to use a jumper wire to connect the right lead of the switch to the ground rail. The other lead will go to the microcontroller to tell it that a button is being pressed. And I'm going to start with my rightmost switch by connecting the right lead to ground. And I'm going to do this for all of the switches, my white key switches on the bottom. So for the top switches, I'm connecting the rightmost lead to the upper ground rail. What's nice about using jumper wires is that it makes it really easy to connect your switches on the breadboard. Now that all the rightmost leads of my switches are connected to ground, I'm going to use a jumper wire so that I can connect all of the switches at the top of the breadboard. This will make it a lot easier to use all of the buttons. Now that I have all of my jumpers in place for the switches, I'm going to add jumpers for the potentiometers. For each potentiometer, I'm first going to add a jumper to connect both of them to the voltage rail. Now that I've added jumpers to connect the potentiometers to the voltage rail, I'm going to add jumpers to connect the potentiometers to the ground rail as well. Now I'm going to add a couple of jumpers to clean up the wiring for the potentiometers. They will allow me to connect the wires from the Leonardo off to the side of the potentiometers. Now that I have those jumpers done, I'm going to add the potentiometers. So for this, they don't sit down perfectly flat, but they will work. You just put them in the breadboard and they'll be somewhat tilted. If you find that your potentiometers work in the opposite direction from what you want, you can simply switch the connections to the voltage and ground rail. Now I'm going to add the keycaps. I like to have the buttons placed first and add the caps one at a time so that I know exactly what color I want where. You just take the switches out and push the cap onto them. Similar to a traditional piano keyboard, I have white keys on the bottom and black keys on the top. Now we're ready to add jumper wires to connect the breadboard to our Leonardo. First, I'm going to take my jumper wires and I'm going to peel off one of them to connect the ground rail to the Leonardo. Next, I'm going to use a jumper to connect the voltage rail on the breadboard to the voltage pin on the Leonardo. Now I'm going to use 2 wires to connect the potentiometers to the analog pins on the Leonardo. Since I'm using 12 switches, I'll use 12 of the remaining jumper wires and peel off the rest. At the top of the Leonardo, there are 12 pins, which makes it very easy to connect to with the jumper wires. Now that we have the breadboard connected, it's time to program. Once the Leonardo is connected to my computer, we are ready to begin programming by opening the Arduino IDE. We're going to start with pulling up the GitHub website for the library. This is where we're going to download the library that will allow us to easily create the MIDI controller. Starting on this screen, you're going to click on Clone or Download, and then Download as zip. This will download a zip file into your computer's download folder. Once downloaded, open the Arduino IDE. Now I'm going to full screen the window to make it easier to work with. I'm going to go up to Sketch, Include Library, and then Add Zip Library. Then I'm going to navigate to my computer's download folder and find the library that I just downloaded, MIDI Controller Master. I'm going to check to make sure that the library is downloaded by going to File, Examples, and then scrolling down to look for MIDI controller. Now that I see that the library is downloaded, I'm going to open the example that's called Button. This example allows us to program a single button with our MIDI controller. I'm going to highlight all of the code and copy it. Then I'm going to start a new project, and I'm going to clear it and then paste in the button example code. This line of code defines the first note in my MIDI controller, which is middle C. This line of code assigns the previously defined note to pin number 2, meaning that when I push a button connected to pin number 2, it should send out MIDI note number 60. Because I'm using 12 buttons, I'm going to repeat this process 11 more times. First, I will define 11 more notes, and then I will assign those 11 notes to 11 more buttons. Now that my buttons are all set up, I'm going to add a couple of lines of code to also set up my potentiometers. I'm going to go up to File, Examples, MIDI Controller. I'm going to open the example called Potentiometer. In this example, I'm going to copy this line of code. I'm going to paste that line under the bottom of my code. Now I'm going to go up to File, Examples, and I'm going to open the high-res potentiometer example. I'm then going to copy this line of code and paste it into my code. Then I'm going to name the potentiometers Potentiometer 1 and Potentiometer 2. The first potentiometer should control volume, so I'm going to call it volume. My second one should control pitch bend, so I'll say that it is pitch bend. And lastly, I'm going to define what pins my potentiometers are connected to. My first one is connected to analog pin 0, but my second one is connected to analog pin 1, so I'm going to change that. Now I should be ready to upload my code to the Leonardo. With the programming complete, we are now ready to test it. I will be using GarageBand, but you can also use almost any online MIDI synthesizer. Cue the theme music.